Say again?
Are we still getting a virtual setup?
Yeah, it's on. Representative Haston is on. I've got the recording going and the slides are available for the folks who are dialed in. So here we go. Yes, we're ready to start.
Hello, good morning, rainy day. Appreciate all of you being here for kind of the last steering committee meeting, and just kind of wanted to set the table as Leader Landforth said last time. These are public meetings. It's the last of this very robust community engagement process. For today, ideally, want to just be able to go through kind of some of these final recommendations from the subcommittees. There were some really important policy considerations that they looked at. I think there was not necessarily consensus just because they're relatively challenging pieces to put together in decisions. Wanted to be able to spend some time today annotating what those are, kind of what we've heard and what we think the right direction might be, and get your feedback. And then certainly on any of the components or any other questions, happy to have that kind of broader engagement and dialogue. But there are some very specific questions that we want to get your feedback on and hear some directions so we can make that call and move forward. But want to pause there. I don't know if Butch, you've got anything to start. Okay.
No.
Okay, so are we good to dive in? Is that okay? Great. So I will skip through the agenda. We will just kind of went over that. And then go more into the policy feedback. So if we're looking at the policy feedback and the base, we talked about that last time. And so just to kind of give a sense of what the subcommittee feedback has been, the base really is about the things that would naturally be true for any child, regardless of where they go to school in the state of Tennessee. So things like, I have a teacher, there is a school building that is maintained, I have some kind of instructional materials that are in front of me. We had a lot of feedback on some additional components. One of those was technology. Obviously, there's been a massive infusion of tech, especially kind of one-on-one, whether those are computers or other devices for learning. Currently, we spend about $40 per student per year on average in the BEP. What we did, I think, and Chairman Watson gave some pretty direct feedback last time about being more direct on what that funding should be and enumerating that. So for technology, we looked at typical replacement cycles of technology by grade band. We also looked at what the state rate was. If districts want to purchase not on the state rate, that is their decision, but we do negotiate a very, very competitive rate as a state. And so wanted to see if there are other things that you would like considered in the base. In those discussions, the big things, again, technology. We heard a lot about counselors, nurses, college and career. Was a really big college and career coaches, really specifically focusing on getting students on a pathway, getting them into coursework that will earn dual credit. That came up quite a bit from our industry and higher ed subcommittees. And then we've heard, I think probably, a decent amount, as you can expect, on educator salaries. That came up quite a bit. Deferred maintenance was another one that we've heard about. So want to just kind of pause there and see if there are any reflections, feedback, direction that you want to give related to the base itself and things you would want to see considered in that space.
Was transportation included in the base?
Yeah, transportation was in there. Yeah, apologies. And so we also, what we've done to enumerate what that is as a starting point is we looked, the federal government actually put some averages. We looked at similar types of communities across states. We also looked at what districts submitted as their actual costs. And then when we thought about sparsity, which is one of the potential weights, part of what the sparsity weight should cover is the significant increase in transportation costs that would naturally happen because of the community you live in. So trying to normalize that for what would be true for any student, and looked at those real expenses. And then Butch and I had conversations about gas prices and inflation and all of those things that go into those particular conversations.
Is like facility operations included in the base? Like, I know you said maintenance, I get that, but like capital, because a newer facility would operate more efficiently than an older facility. How's that?
Well, capital, I haven't reviewed all these yet, but I don't think capital would be in the bases, but the operation costs certainly are, which, as you said, have a correlation to capital. So, but the intent if you look at all these items, the intent is to drill down to get the most actual data related to that specific item. So if you look at current inflation of gas, then it's obviously higher at this point in time than some of the other items. And so trying to take all that into account, utilizing as much actual data as I think we can to make sure that we're hitting on the right number.
I guess this is probably just for my education on it. When I think of the base, I'm thinking of all the components so you've got utilities, maintenance, facilities, labor, which gets to the teacher, and whatever other labor is in there, supplies. Right? So those are all part of that conversation.
Yeah, that's right.
So do we have a base that started from scratch that has built that up to this juncture?
Yes, that's right. So from a process perspective, we, and I think really helpful feedback and direction that we got last time, we did not actually start with the BEP. I think, and that was a conversation, and I think some really good push for us. We started with a blank slate. We did look at what components are currently funded so that from a categorical perspective, we can say, okay, great, we don't want to miss custodial. We don't want to miss materials. And then we looked at the data that our districts submitted. Many of them submitted kind of what their real expenses were, what they were spending money on, what looked consistent. Frankly, what was local district preference, and you might want to spend money on that, but that's not necessarily a fundamental requirement for a child's education. We looked at other states to see what they considered, whether that was in their actual statute or in their public comment of what was in the base. And then we actually looked at what the real cost would be and added that up. Now, here's one of the things that you'll see is a difference. In our current BEP, we have things, again, because we have all the 46 different components that are just specific to elementary ADM or that are just specific to high school ADM. That's not how it works in a base anymore. And so what we can do now is say, great, the BEP might have funded instructional assistance just for our K through 5 or K through 4 students. We can still have instructional assistance as something that we know is part of the regular education program that you would see in elementary school. But since that is now just for elementary school, it allows us to ensure that there is some funding for academic advising at the high school level. And so that's the kind of nuance that we went into and started to enumerate all of those pieces and cost them in real costs, looking at the state kind of real expenses.
So we put out there $1 billion in spending, proposed spending this year, and the governor's proposed budget, $750 million after that. Is there a base number based on starting from scratch at this juncture where we're looking at everything that's been spent on a kid? Are we at the point where we know kind of what the base is, the goal base now, and what the base should be, whether it's too high, too low? If we start from scratch, and I've been kind of interested to hear that number for a while. I mean, where are we and where do we need to go?
Yeah, so I think we are in a place where we have a really good sense of what that actual dollar number is. What we're doing right now is a lot of checks and balances on our own work, just to make sure that when we actually have the conversation and say, here's the number, we've done the back work to all the safety nets to make sure that's a real number. I will say when we look at that number compared to kind of what we allocate now, there is a difference. It is a larger number because it does include some of those components that we got from the subcommittee. So you think about nurses or counselors or academic advising, that's some of the feedback we got from the subcommittees that they would like to see considered in the base. And so that's what we'd be able to break down and break out for you. It is what's nice about that, and I think the push to kind of recreate that in a dollar amount as opposed to in this kind of categorical resource base that we've been in, is that in the conversations that we'll have in the coming weeks, you can say, like, look, that's actually not something that we think should be funded in the base. That's something that's extra. And that's something you can actually just take out in real time because we have a dollar figure associated per student as opposed to a ratio that has very different kinds of impact. So that's one of the things that we'll be able to talk about in much more specific detail.
Does that include, in that base, are you including things like school resource officers?
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that there's some local issues that are not included. Give us some examples of what those might be.
Yep. So I'm going to use some. So a fun one is just like some locals spend a lot of money on their the gardening and some of the beautification of their facilities. So They might have a community garden, and that is wonderful, genuinely. Not something that we might say is a requirement for a base education across the state. Others might say, you know, we want enough money to have multiple types of recreational spaces so that we don't have to make the shifts in the day and we can really just devote that. That's a lot more square footage per child that you would then be funding for some of your maintenance and operations. So instead of saying, hey, each student is allocated 130 square feet of space within a school building at the high school level, now we've actually increased that to, okay, we're funding 140 square feet because this school actually wanted to have 6 or 7 different spaces as opposed to 1. So those are 2 examples on either end.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. No question?
Is there,
Yeah.
well,
Yes, sir.
I mean, is there a reason that we don't have an inventory of all this? I mean, I would have thought that we might sit down here and in this base, on this base slide, that I would have in column form a series of specific things that you're recommending to the steering committee that we recommend to the legislative process. This feels a little, I'm not opposed to it, but it feels a little open-ended, that I'm going to walk out of here and I'm not going to really know what we've kind of put in the base. I'm going to have heard a lot of concepts that have been introduced and discussed, but I'm not going to know what's in, unless I sit here and say, well, is this in the base? Is that in the base? So I think that's kind of what I was looking for out of this conversation, was the specifics from what you've heard across, and I may be the only member feeling this way, but I kind of expected to see a little more detail, a little more meat on the bone than I see right now, candidly.
Yeah, I think that absolutely fair and appreciate that. I think this is intended to be more open-ended to ensure we're not missing anything, because what we want to be able to get you is all of that together, because any decision we make on the base, the next natural question is then what does that do to all of the weights? And that's where we start to, there's a lot of relative comparisons there. And so we want to get you that and be able to answer the immediate next question, which is, and then what does that mean for how much additional that's going to create in all of the different weight categories? Okay, is that really important if it balloons it up this much? We aren't able to do that until we know these are the things that really matter to you versus not.
But Commissioner, I mean, we don't know that until we see the list.
And the price tag.
Yeah, well, the price tag's another, you know, I can get separating the discussions. I can get that, you know, let's separate the discussions. But I think what we need, because otherwise we're going to sit here and say, well, is this on the list?
Yeah.
And then we're going to have another conversation and something's going to pop into the leader's head and he's going to say, well, is this on the list?
Yeah.
Versus
Can
having.
can we not provide that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can print that actually. That's what print that on the computer.
That way we.
I'll send it to you. Yeah,
Yeah, it's very
absolutely.
helpful.
We're happy to.
Well, my chair's point, I mean, you know, some of these items, I mean, we may have aspirational goals of being able to fund certain things, but depending upon, I mean, we put out a very bold plan. Y'all put out a very bold plan for $1 billion of spending this year and 750 million recurring. I mean, to me, with the base of 6.6 billion K through 12 education spending, plus a lot of federal money that's come in since then. I mean, you know, that's an enormous amount of money. Does that do the job? Is that too much, too little? I mean, depending upon what the price tag on most of those issues are, I mean, it's still a funding conversation.
Absolutely.
On what we can and cannot afford, so to speak.
And I guess one of the things that kind of raised my antenna a bit when you said this is the last meeting of the steering committee. So to Chairman Watson's point, there seems to be a lot of open-ended questions. I don't see anything, and we're not done, I realize that, but you know, going from what we've talked about on this issue to a plan that I'm ready to tell my colleagues about. Yes, there's a lot of steps in between.
Well, for instance, and I don't know if it's on the sheet that you're about to print, but I had a note later on to ask about, you know, we'd ask about local match funding and the local components of what their capacity is. And then I was hoping to see that today potentially and see where that matches up. Because I mean, just when you mentioned the gardens issue, a lot of that has gone to some of their STEM and STEAM academies that we pushed at the state level for, you know, quite a long time for them to do that. Some of that stuff's FFA, some of it's others. It doesn't all necessarily go in a specific formula, but I understand why they're doing that. And some of that potentially does go to their capacity issues and what they choose to spend that on. So I don't know if that's on that list or not, but I mean, it's all education funding for our children.
That's right.
And so that local capacity specifically on how we figure what their capacity is and what they do above and beyond that, I mean, that's up to each local jurisdiction. Is that something we'll see?
Yes, and I do want to just be really candid about, we are in the middle of drafting, and so part of what we want to be able to do is before anything would be filed, we're having a very different conversation where we're actually saying, here's what the bill language is, here's what that translates to in the formula calculations, here's what that means for every single district. That is 100% something that we will be talking about before anything would become public, getting feedback on that. That's right. But every decision that we make from like a broader policy has massive implications in terms of how we're thinking things downstream. We want to get you very accurate information where you can compare bill language and actual dollar figures. But until some of these policy decisions are made broadly, it ends up adding a lot of different variables into the picture. So I'm happy to also schedule another meeting where we actually just say, great, we've made these big policy decisions. Now let's get into the brass tacks of some of the dollars and cents and the translation. Also, more than happy to create whatever time is helpful, important, necessary. That's no problem at all.
I appreciate it, but inviting the legislature into this discussion as part of the steering committee, that's almost, you're just gonna have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you're either gonna answer these questions up front and get them out of the way, or we're gonna spend 3 months answering, you're gonna end up 3 months answering it from 33 different members in the Senate and 99 different members in the House. And I think the role of the steering committee is to be able to go back to our membership and confidently say, we have distilled this down. There may be some subtleties that we need to address, but we have distilled this down and are prepared to present it to you. If you were asking me to walk out of here today and even be close to doing that, we're not even in the same neighborhood.
And Commissioner, I will say, I
that would not
understand that some of this potentially may be materials that are submitted to us when we get some sort of draft language, at least I would hope. That's fine to have some of this, some supporting materials and all this, but this is the kind of stuff that we're all gonna want to see. So, it's not like I think everybody's expecting you to have like all this right down at this moment, but at some juncture, as we're evaluating it, the budget, obviously, the budgeting does drive some of these conversations, and where you move some of this means potentially less money, more money, moving around money. I'm trying hard not to look at the budget, but the budget controls a lot of the conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's a consensus.
Yep, that's great. We're happy to do that. Brent is printing, so while he's printing, if we can do some of the policy questions, I think that would just make sure we're maximizing time. This is a really big one, and I think to the point earlier about one decision that can have a massive influence on the types of numbers you see is how we calculate economically disadvantaged. We talked a little bit about that last time. I want to just walk through what that policy decision looks like and what the different implications are. So we have two options. There's economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty. Option one is we use a kind of expanded version of what we do now, which is direct certification. And we use the federal definition, which includes foster care, runaway, homeless, and migrant. That is essentially what is the economically disadvantaged definition right now with direct certification. Concentration of poverty or Title I schools, which means more than 40% of the students meet that definition. The other option that was discussed on the subcommittee is that we do free and reduced price meal forms. So that was the form that the parent fills out, they provide documentation, the school verifies whether or not that's accurate. And then we fund for concentration of poverty those students who are at a Title I school. There are some pros and cons to both of those. I do want to provide the context is most of the subcommittees liked option two, except for the subcommittee that focused on economically disadvantaged students, and they preferred option one. So that was a little bit of I was not expecting necessarily that. So want to make sure that you all see the pros and cons and can give feedback on what you would like to see. For option one, the pros are it's low bureaucracy. There aren't additional forms. It's something that's kind of more of an automatic generation of data we already have. It is higher in accuracy. That is because, again, it is direct certification based on existing information. It also prioritizes the most high needs students. So when you think of someone who's eligible for direct certification, it means they are a certain number of standard deviations below the poverty line. It assures that it is literally for our kind of most economically disadvantaged students. The cons are it does not address our reduced price students. So it does not include those as part of, they would not get a weight as reduced price. That tends to be students who maybe have one or more parents who are employed, but they are still below, within some level of standard deviation of the poverty line, but we would call them reduced price. They pay part of their lunch back if we're looking kind of 15 years ago. For option 2, the pros are, it would include those kids, the kids who normally get reduced price lunch. We kind of call it, it's not quite the working poor, but some people use that terminology. You might have 2 parents who are making minimum wage. It's a family with 2 kids, minimum wage for both their parents. Some cons. The cons are, it would go back to collecting the forms. We did have some hesitation from parents about, so you mean you're going to come after me for those forms again? That was a direct quote we got in the feedback. So, you know, the calls, the emails, the knocking on doors, like, I need your form because I, as a school, don't get funding unless I get your form and information. So we had some pushback from parents about that. This typically disadvantages high schools. High school parents are less likely to complete forms for free and reduced price meals, just like they tend to be less likely on average going to parent-teacher conferences. You see much more engagement in the elementary school space. We have heard that feedback, sometimes with middle school. It also tends to impact negatively communities with families who are less likely to want to give government entities personal information. They are significantly less likely to fill out the forms. If they don't, the school doesn't generate the funding. And then the last, in my opinion, kind of the biggest con I'd like us to talk through is we went and looked at the error rate on forms. Because when you make an error back when it was just about meals, there is a threshold of tolerance of, you're going to make some mistakes. Maybe some kids get milk and they shouldn't have gotten milk, or some kids got a lunch and they shouldn't have gotten a lunch. But that is the level of tolerance. When now we are talking about dollars, that is a different level of audit. That error rate tends to be 6 to 8%. So if you are putting a weight on a student who is qualified for this, let's just say it's $1,000 that student gets above the base. Now, 6 to 8% of students are getting funded $1,000 more than they should have. That is a very, very high threshold. It likely means now districts are having to pay that money back. You cannot get that in real time like direct certification. It's an audit function, which means we distribute the money based on the form. We audit against the forms. 6 to 8% of those forms are inaccurate. And now we have to bill the district back because they got funded and they shouldn't have. That is the biggest issue. We get more kids, more of the reduced price kids are covered in option 2. And from an audit perspective, it is very challenging and potentially expensive. I want to just provide that because I can argue both sides in both ways, depending on the way, like how we want to approach it. But it is a very big policy level decision. It also has significant implications on what the actual formula might look like. So I wanted to, hopefully that gave the context.
Throw something out there. I think I mentioned
Yes,
this
sir.
last time. So, and I'm going to summarize kind of what I've heard. It may or may not have been what you wish to convey. So I want to make sure I didn't mishear. So option 2 is much more specific to the child's needs, but it's hard, even though it's over 90% accurate, and thus there's some cons because it's hard, but over 90% accurate.
So I'm going
Because the
to,
first one takes categories of communities and makes assumptions that if you fall within certain groups, that you must be economically disadvantaged. Whether you are or not, I mean, you could be in extremely good shape, but it's very difficult for us to ask you to fill out a form. And so, I mean, am I understanding right?
so direct certification, it would still be at a student level because we would still have to identify which students are direct certified, which students are homeless or foster. So both are at the student level. It is just a matter of the difference between the two is option 2 is a wider universe of students because it's not just free. If we're going back to free and reduced, option 2 isn't just free, it's also the reduced price students who are eligible.
But in option 1, and when we were here last time, again, this is what I want to clarify.
Yep.
It sounded like we were told last time, and I went back and checked my notes on this, and it could have been I just wrote it down wrong, is that it was based in large part on the demographics of those particular groups and of the community at large around that particular school.
So that was a solution. So some states just use direct certification, and as a way to capture reduced if you wanted to, then they apply a multiplier. That was one of the approaches that we.
Are we doing that now? Or
No,
not doing
this
that
would
now?
just be direct cert with no multiplier.
No, I'm not talking about the proposal.
Yeah.
Currently, right now,
Currently,
is that how we're doing it?
we just do direct cert. That is what we do.
Okay. So how do you identify these children in option one if there's no form or anything to identify them? How would you have that
Do you
information?
want to,
Yeah, so if I break it apart, in option one, the first part, EcoDisc direct certification, all requires forms. That is, you are receiving SNAP or TANF benefits, you are categorized as homeless, migrant, foster, or a runaway student. So all of those have verification forms associated with them. So that part, totally auditable, tracks through. Concentration of poverty, as it's defined here, you're a student in a Title I school. A Title I school is.
Hang on, and that's what last time I thought I understood, like concentration of poverty, you're talking about in that particular community, X percentage of that community based on census numbers or something, I'm assuming, there's a concentration of poverty, not necessarily that the kids at that school are, but there's an assumption made there because the community at large is, those children must be.
So for the Title I designation in this definition, the district must identify that school to be a Title I school and meet the federal requirements of it, which presumes some level of poverty of the actual students in that school building.
Based on the demographics of the larger neighborhood that it is contained within, without forms or anything like that. Just this neighborhood is for the children at the school must therefore be.
That's the flip part. Actually, when a school designate, or sorry, when a district designates a school as a Title I, it is about the kids in that school building, not the
Yes.
community at large.
And again, so without doing a form, which is difficult, and while over 90%, accurate, I get some error there. How are you determining that? I thought I understood that, but I'm hearing something different today. So how are you determining that if you're not putting something in the parent's hands saying, what's your income, what's your status, what are the basic you see what I'm missing here? I'm not sure how you're getting there if you're not.
These actually will overlap a little bit. Like for a district to determine my school is a Title I school, I'm looking at the kids in it to see what rate of them fall into direct served. What rate of them are homeless, migrant, foster.
I get that part, but then again, it's where you lose me is the next part, where you say, how many, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The broader kids in the school building?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's the part of it being a school designation of Title I. So that, I
so
think.
that's my
is
question, the
speaking to-
logistics of
yeah.
how you get to
I see
that,
what you're
if there's
asking,
no forms or information gathered from those particular individuals, how is one making that assumption?
it's part of what is eligible. So you think about families who are eligible for TANF, for other benefits. That is actually where you pull the information from. So the school doesn't need to do a separate form. I see what you're saying.
That's what I'm
Yep.
looking for.
Yep.
Where is that information coming
SNAP,
directly from?
TANF, all of like
So
those
we have
programs.
the addresses and we know as the state of Tennessee where those individuals are, and you're pulling that data from that.
Yes.
Where's the list of all that? I know we have a list now of this, but I mean, where's the list of how we pull that data?
So that's going to be from other third-party sources, so if you are eligible for the SNAP program, if you are on public assistance of some kind, if you have some of those types of public assistance, then you are attached to that public assistance, and that's where we pull the third-party identifiable. So someone else is doing forms in some other place for that. We are using that previously verified information to qualify the student. I am a
All right.
student who lives in a.
Maybe I'm the only one that missed that in the last meeting, but.
No, that's our
extremely
fault
helpful.
if we did not communicate that well.
That was not, I mean, that's what I was trying to figure
Yeah.
out. Somebody somewhere has got to be filling out a
Yeah,
form.
that's right.
Or we're just making broad assumptions.
That's right.
It's just being filled out in a different category than those particular children. All right. I get it.
And it's
Yeah, thank
already
you.
been verified and validated for it to come over here, so we don't have that same audit process. They've already been audited.
That's why it's more accurate.
Mhm.
That's right.
Yeah.
in a sense.
I have much less problem with that explanation versus like last time. I don't know what else feels, but I
Yeah,
mean,
no. That's, we wanted to come back and get, so I mean, is there feedback on which option one, option two, what feels, in terms of how much money districts get, just so you know kind of what that looks like from an outcomes perspective as we're starting to model some of this? There isn't a real difference. The biggest in terms of dollars, the biggest difference is going to be that you're going to have some of your students who are reduced price in a high income school are included in option two, but are not included in option one. Conversely, more students who are at reduced price in a Title I school would be funded in option one. So that is the difference. So if you're a reduced price kid, you are going to get funded in option one. If you are at a Title I school, if you are in option two, you will get funded if you are in a wealthier school. That is essentially the biggest difference.
But one option does not have an additional burden on the school
That's right.
having to produce and collect a form and collect data.
That's exactly
It
right.
removes that burden or doesn't contemplate that burden of saying the school's got to go to the parent, you got to fill this out, give me your income information.
Yeah.
Isn't that a huge deal? I think so.
School district, so I think it depends on the district. I think the districts are, what they've said is if I have to fill out a form to get more money for more kids, and that's what I want to do. And if I have to bang down every single door to get that form, I'm going to get the form. I think from a school district perspective, they care about how am I going to get more of my kids, the additional funding. That's why for option 1, the way we've accounted for that is saying instead of just the low income child at the Title I school, we are saying you are this direct certification child. And then no matter what, if any kids at a Title I school, they are essentially all being impacted by concentration of poverty. So when districts actually see it play out in the totals, they aren't going to, option 1 is actually better for significantly more districts because we don't currently fund anything related to concentration of poverty now. So that is, it's hard. I think for them, they're like, if I have to get the form to get the money, I'm going to get the form. This is a way that is less time intensive, less bureaucratic, and they actually are still going to be funded for the kids who need the support the most. But
And
that's
there's
a
no
good
risk
question.
with the audit.
And yes, so we
Yeah. And you don't have to go back and audit it later.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's pretty clear, just from a
Yeah.
streamlined.
Anytime you stay away from bureaucracy, you're gonna save money.
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
option 1.
Okay, great. That's helpful.
I'm more comfortable with option 1. I'd still like to hear more details on how we're getting the information.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
just, but it's a heck of a lot clearer than it was before,
Yep.
definitely.
Okay, I have a question before we
Yes, sir.
get away from that. I do think that there's a issue about the reduced price
Mhm.
population there.
Mhm.
Has there been discussion about a mechanism of trying to move that into option 1 in any shape, form, or fashion?
The only way to do that is the form, because there isn't, those families don't qualify for TANF or SNAP or the direct certification components. And so the way that you identify a reduced price child in terms of free and reduced price meals is the form.
So could that be an option for parents in option 1? Could you move that as an option in option 1?
Yes, we can do whatever we want, and whatever you all decide is best. We can move that in there. You are still going to have the effects of
But
districts are
not,
going
not
to,
for everyone, just for this that falls through the cracks in option 1 that would be covered in option 2.
and yes, and what will end up happening is districts don't know who qualifies in advance, and neither does the parent. You have to fill out the form to know if you qualify. If I'm being honest, from a parent's perspective, it doesn't change anything for me. My kid still gets free lunch. Because we have community eligibility provisions, my kid is still getting to a school with a classroom and a teacher. The district is the one who's going to want to get that information, and they're going to want it from every single parent because there's no way to know.
Okay,
And that's the hard part.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course, yes, sir. Okay. For unique learning needs, this was a follow-up question, and I just wanted to make clear, this is the definition of how we would assess and for third-party verification. Any student who qualifies for a unique learning needs, you think about children right now, based on the initial feedback, students with disabilities, students with characteristics of dyslexia, students who speak a language other than English, and then students who, oh my goodness, characteristics of dyslexia, students with disabilities, English learners, and I'm missing one. Or that might be it. Those are all of them. Gifted, which is part of our students with disabilities state statute. You have to have an assessment and you have to have a plan for that student. That is currently what exists within those categories. So if you are a student with a disability, there was some assessment that qualified you, and now you have an IEP plan. If you're an English learner, you have taken the test that designates you, and you have an individual learning plan. If you are a student with characteristics of dyslexia, you have a screener that identifies you as characteristics of dyslexia, and you would have a plan associated with the services. Those are all things that are written into statute. So that is kind of the minimum expectation. I think there was some question and feedback last time about how will we know for sure that you can't game the system. Those are all things that currently exist and that we are currently required to audit against as a department and with the federal government. We actually have to report things like significant disproportionality, meaning you've over-identified students compared to what is expected, We have to audit against whether you had a major increase, et cetera. So there's not change in process here. There's no additional paperwork, reporting, et cetera. We do think that that has to be a minimum expectation for getting funding, that we have some kind of third-party way in which we can identify that is actually a student who has that need. But I think that was one of the direct questions we got last time. I wanted to follow up as kind of assessment and plan both have to be in place.
What you handed out just a moment ago on the base,
Yep.
the question came up just a few minutes ago on
Yes, sir.
SROs, on whether or not that was included in there. I don't see it on there. Is it coded under something that I'm not recognizing?
Yep, sir. So if
School
you look,
safety.
school safety.
So it's falling under that umbrella.
Yeah, so that
All right,
includes
cool.
both the SRO as well as some of the hardening. Districts have the option right now, and we want to make sure they have that flexibility. So that's how we
All right.
categorize it.
Well, I know we've categorized school safety as multiple different things. Just want to make sure SROs kind of fits into that.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Do we want to go
Did-
back to the base? or-
No, but before we
yeah,
get
let's-
off of unique learning needs.
Yes, sir.
Let's finish this discussion. So again, I'm kind of, if there's a list of the, I guess those are the only 4 or 5 things. Those are the only things of which there is a reliable and valid test that's done to establish that a student fits in one of those categories. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes, sir.
And there's not, even though people may have other ideas about things that need to be included as a unique learning need, there is no reliable, valid way for testing for it, so we wouldn't include it.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
I'd say that's, yeah, that's right. And these are the ones that you typically see when you look at what every state funds. Every state has some kind of additional funding that goes for students with disabilities, English learners in particular, and then low income, which is obviously a different weight. As a state, in state statute, we include gifted as part of students with disabilities, and that's something that is unique to Tennessee, so they are in there. The biggest piece of feedback, and frankly, the only one that we heard a lot of feedback on for weights for unique learning needs, meaning I need additional services to meet academic expectations. The only one we really heard was on characteristics of dyslexia, because that oftentimes has a IEP associated, but a lot of times you have students with moderate dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia that don't qualify for an IEP, but cannot meet academic goals unless they get additional service. And so that was something that we heard pretty significantly about. So that's the only one that's different than what we currently fund.
Because there's not, they don't meet the criteria
Mhm.
in these other 5 categories.
Yes, that's right.
Molly, not to get personal, but I know I shared that last time. I'll say it again. I mean, yes, that we experienced that. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the testing itself draws it out. Our daughter did not fit any of those categories or whatever, but it definitely was more time intensive and labor intensive for the school. They did extra things with her that quite frankly addressed that issue, and she's great. So it makes sense to me. I don't know if that helps anybody else, but I mean, it caught it on a test and it was kind of nuanced, and
Yeah.
it did take more labor on their part. So I get the additional funding.
Yeah.
So what was the subcommittee's recommendation from that discussion?
So the subcommittees, and I would say this, it was the students with disabilities and gifted learners was the subcommittee. They spent a lot of time on that. And I think it was really important because it is something different and new. And I think one of the things they highlighted was what Leader Lamberth was speaking to, which is there are a number of students who don't qualify as having a disability, but absolutely need additional services, and there isn't the support in place. But what they did say is that they absolutely believe there should be an assessment. It can't just be because I believe this is true and we have a screener, it is already required. And so the second part of that is, how do we know what services that child needs? In the law, it does say that there has to be some kind of screener and there has to be planning that goes into place. So we would have both of those things to meet that minimum criteria, but it is a significant amount of students in the state that currently generate that level of service. And it is essentially silent in our current funding formula on this particular group.
So let me see if I can squeeze you a little bit on this.
Yes, sir.
So what was the recommendation of the subcommittee?
The
Did they
recommend- yeah.
recommend that we figure out a way to fund that?
Yes.
Was that their recommendation?
The recommendation was, it was a strong recommendation that characteristics of dyslexia should be a weight, and that should be grouped together with the other unique learning needs of similar students.
Okay, so my request to you then would be, for, at least for me, to consider that as an option, since it's a recommendation from the subcommittee. I need a little bit more information about how you would propose that we do that, because that's going to add cost to the system, right? I get that, but if that's something that the subcommittee felt really strongly about, then I think for the steering committee, we need to understand that a little bit more in more detail.
Okay.
And I'd like to understand, and I'm probably just not following here, but when we talk about characteristics of dyslexia, so there's testing and, you know, I'm dyslexic or not, I suppose. It's either or, but then you're saying that might not meet the criteria for dyslexic, but I have some of the characteristics of that require the additional work. How do you test for that? How do you define that?
Yeah, so I'm smiling because it's been so much conversation on this, and I'm being very careful to use the whole term characteristics of dyslexia. That was something that has been very important to that particular group, that I use the full term. And so I'm trying to be very cognizant of doing that. And I appreciated their strong push there. So for characteristics of dyslexia, it might be especially for our youngest learners, and this really does focus a lot on that K through third grade space. You might not have a specific diagnosis, but you are exhibiting all of the characteristics that would lead to that. So it might be that you are inverting some of your letters within your words. It might be that you haven't made the connection between your phonological awareness and concepts in print. And so what it is it's saying there is enough to know that this child needs additional services, because it does look like they do qualify as having dyslexia, maybe not in an IEP. And so so we're trying to mimic the current state statute. The current state statute says characteristics of dyslexia. That is what the law says now. So we are trying to mimic that language. All that being said,
But there is some
there is a
objective
test. Yes.
methodology.
So I'll tell you,
Absolutely.
when they sat us down and literally called us in as parents and said, hey, look, you know, here's all their test scores. These two areas over here, and she's getting A's and B's and everything else. And it blew my mind too. But I mean, all this specific testing that people talk about and over testing and all this, it came home to me where I was like, okay, I get it, why it's broken down so much. And it was like, look, I mean, she was flipping letters within words and faking it great. You know what I mean? Was making it through it just by working harder. She read a little slower. She flipping letters. When you really drilled down on it, they were like, hey, here's the 3 areas that show those characteristics. And they drilled down on it. I mean, it was very methodical, and quite frankly, it was interesting. You know, as a parent, you kind of freak out when they say, hey, look, your kid's got a diagnosis of whatever on whatever spectrum, but it was able to be diagnosed, identified, and very specific actions afterwards. I don't know if all schools do that, but I think that's the conversation, right?
It is. And I think when you think about children who are still learning to read, it's hard to identify dyslexia until they
By the way,
are
I should have
fluent
mentioned
readers.
this was like 3rd grade.
Yep.
So it's like during that time period when they're doing some of the behavior testing,
That's
and
right.
that's what they told us. They said, look, if we catch this stuff early, we address it, we deal with it, we move on.
That's
If
right.
you catch it in like 8th grade or 9th grade or something, well, it's game over, it's already ingrained.
That's
Is that
right.
fair enough?
Yes, that's absolutely true.
So, I don't know if that's helpful or not, Chairman, but that was our journey.
Different subject, everyone, different years.
Well, and just one final question on
Yes, ma'am.
disabilities. If you have a child, in personal opinion, way too many children we have on ADHD medication and those sorts of things, does that qualify you as in that disabled category, or just get you an IEP plan? How does that work?
Yep, so great question. And that's where I think the assessment plus the plan component is critical here. So the child has a series of assessments. Those are sometimes are academic, sometimes those are other types of assessments depending on the potential disability that is the child might be qualified for. Once that assessment happens, the parent and the school system have to agree to what the plan is. Currently, and our recommendation would be to stay consistent, we fund what are called option codes. And as a state, we have 10 option codes. And that's based, again, on the resources by, frankly, it's mostly instructional staff and again, some materials. If you have a student who has ADHD and medication, that child would have to qualify as an assessment on the assessment as having a disability, and everyone needs to agree that it requires an IEP. What would happen is that child would qualify for some level of services, maybe, and if they do, we would fund the actual services as opposed to anything else. So I'm thinking about, so there might be a child in 2nd grade. That child has other health impairment, and that's what their IEP is about, which usually is kind of a catch-all for some very specific other components of that the child might have needs in. That child might need support just with transitions. So from going from the classroom to the multi-purpose room, changing activities, they need to have a paraprofessional come in, support that child with transitions in kindergarten and 1st grade. You would only be funded for that, what that service is as listed in your IEP, which is a federal document. It doesn't mean that just because a student is on medication, they automatically qualify for anything. Yes, sir.
Just a thought, this may be for later discussion, but as we're looking at this new DEP funding model, one of the reasons we're doing this for accountability of how the locals are using the money that comes from the state. And one of my pet peeves with that in operations is it seems like, especially in your larger urban areas, you have 200 schools.
Yep.
They don't spend the money on maintenance, preventive maintenance. And I've been to schools where the roofs are leaking or there's major problems and the kids are going to school and the situation's not. And it seems like a lot of the districts, they won't spend the money. And pretty soon the school bill looks pretty bad and students should have to learn in such an environment. Is there going to be like accountability if you're going to get money from the state on how you maintain your buildings?
Absolutely. And I think for me, the component of that we would now be able to report on is number one, we can actually say how much was generated in funding at the school level, not just at the district, but at the school. We will know how much of that funding generated at the school level was moved to the district versus what stays at the school. On the spending side, we would be able to report, this is how much money was generated for your school for the students who were there. And this is exactly how your school spent that funding or how your district spent that funding if it went to the district level. This percent on classroom teachers, this percent on support staff, this percent on deferred maintenance. We can have a much different grain size of accountability and transparency about spending decisions. And I think that that's going to be a really important switch. At the parent level, when I think about the report I would get about my own child, I can now see this is how much the state has produced for Ellie. This is how much the state has produced for Abby based on each of my kids' individual and specific needs. So we'll be able to report on that to the parent and at the school level and at the district level, both funding and spending. We haven't been able to do that before.
Right.
Which, yeah.
To that end, back to the base that Chairman just brought up. So are these items that are listed here, are currently is this the list that all of the districts are working from? Or did we come up with this? Did y'all come up with this as a result of this exercise?
So we had a form that went out to districts that they had an option. They did not have to fill out, but they could. And it had what we would consider to be the things that every district would think about. They could also add additional lines. So if they had other things, and that's when I used the example of like a community garden, that can be a line that they might have had. But this is all absolutely in the BEP in terms of some of the categories and some of the other ones that we've heard from districts.
It's going to be important going forward to be able to do what you just said, that everybody's working off the same list moving forward. And there's some things on here that I think maybe need some more conversation. That is probably a roll up in some of this costs, but I'm not seeing utilities, for instance, unless it's under maintenance and operation. So I would assume that there's probably some of that going on.
That's right.
You know, and along that same vein, it might be nice to put under these categories, like utilities, if it's under,
Maintenance and
M&O,
operation.
yeah.
What
just kind of sub-list under
there's probably, I don't know, like where we dealing with benefits.
All of that's built into the regular classroom teacher.
Yeah.
So it would be salary, benefits, insurance.
So I think some explanation, just so
Sure.
we're not, people aren't questioning or asking what it is.
Great.
Just one other quick thing. Does anybody rent any, are there any leases out there versus, I mean, I would assume there are.
Yes.
Charters.
That's right.
Other than charters, are there public schools that are leases?
It would be like special, it wouldn't be the actual
unique
campus.
circumstances.
Okay.
Like Humphreys had to lease a space.
Yeah.
After their,
Yeah,
right.
I didn't-
Or portables.
Okay.
For growth, there might be some portables you have to add until you can build the building.
Anyone who's
Okay, yeah.
on a
Wilson.
permanent building.
But that's from the tornado.
Yeah.
They would have,
Some of the district offices may be.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
So would that be rents and lease under operations?
okay.
We do have a bill down there, they won't be paying this anymore.
There's a bill for that.
Public service announcement.
And under your labor category, which
Yes, sir.
you have as salaries, would you have to consider contract labor under that?
For,
I don't know what, I mean, it could be under any of those. I don't know whether school nurses are employees of the district or whether a district might choose to contract with school nurses.
yes,
So-
okay, I see what you're saying. Yes, sir. So what we have budgeted against is that these would all be at the employee rate because that's what we have, that's kind of within the universe of control. This is how much you would pay a school nurse. If a district chooses to do a contract, because that might be where they can get the labor, that might be what's necessary because they don't need a full-time staff member, et cetera, that would be under that same salaries component. So it doesn't limit their flexibility. Custodial is, I think, another one. We have a number of districts who are moving from hiring full-time custodial staff to contract, especially for kind of night cleaning and some of the additional components. So that same custodian staff, that could be contract or it could be actual FTEs.
Okay. So following that same vein.
Yes, sir.
One of the discussions I've got my last one tonight, but one thing that came out in one of my local discussions on this was where you have like elementary school special art, music, and PE,
Yes.
art, music, that's been a heavy conversation.
Yep.
But part of the conversation it kind of moved towards, well, wonder if are you just putting a dollar figure in there? And this is what I heard you just say. We're putting a dollar figure in there based on the cost to the district, but where they access that resource could be left to the district. So for example, if you have $100 in the base, making up a number, $100 in the base for art.
Yep.
The district could contract with a local nonprofit to do and provide the art to
Yes.
the district.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
that you could create, the discussion was around public-private partnerships. Where could you look and find partnerships? So in its essence, you could double your money, for example, if you were working with. Now, not all communities are going to have those kind of resources, but some of the communities like Hamilton, Williamson, Davidson, they wouldn't necessarily have to employ an art teacher.
That's right.
They could provide the art curriculum by partnering with a third party.
That is 100% accurate. It's a funding plan, not a spending plan.
Okay.
Yep. And I think just to kind of, just to get a little bit more specific, because I know that you had asked for that, when we are looking at like an elementary school PE teacher, because there's a statutory requirement about a certain number of minutes for PE. What we would look at is this is how much we fund a teacher with benefits insurance. This is how many students that teacher would fund if they can do, let's say they're doing 25 classes a week because they do an hour class, they do 25 Monday through Friday. That's how many students based on the class sizes. So we have 125 or 200 students are splitting that teacher. That's the per student amount that is allocated here.
Well, the party's over now, David. We were having a good time when we were making all kind of money over here and you showed up.
Wet blanket.
Bring
the
abacus.
I wanted him here,
Yeah.
finalization of all.
Yeah. Get out your abacus.
Take more than abacus.
I do want to, just from some policy on sparsity, that was a question that had come up. The federal definition is 10 per square mile. We heard very overwhelming feedback from the subcommittee that was dealing with rural as well as the others, that we have some very unique and interesting geography in Tennessee. And just because you might be 5 miles away from a city center, if there's a mountain range in between, like that is a real thing for people, rivers, et cetera. The idea is that instead we would go to a 25 students per square mile is the current proposal. When we looked at the districts that were generated under the 10-to-1 versus the 25-to-1, and that was one of the questions the subcommittees had looked for, it was more representative of what we might normally consider to be rural and or sparse. And so that was part of the feedback that was asked for. I think it was Representative Reagan was on one of those committees and asked that question. And then the rural committee really kind of dove into that particular topic. But wanted to just kind of flag that that's the recommendation that came forward. That's what we would be modeling against. So, yeah, yes, sir.
Is the district either sparse or not, or if you have a county like Williamson County, some of it is very rural and very sparse, but then some of it is very dense. So is it, do you either sparse or not, or what?
You can do it at the district level. We can also do it within the school geographic range.
Okay.
So those are things we can toggle with. Right now, we're modeling kind of broadly at the district level to get a sense because it encompasses more districts, frankly, but you can do that at the school level if we needed to do that. Is there a preference, I think, from this group or a way that you'd want us to really think through that?
Well, I think you could, again, William can speak to Sumner, but you got Brentwood High School, middle school, it's very dense. All the students are probably within, a few miles. Then you've got Hillsborough or Page High School, Page Middle School, and it's a very wide rural area. So I think at least the consideration of some flexibility within the district to be able to categorize a school as, I just think of transportation costs.
Yep.
Running buses for the kids at Brentwood High School or Brentwood Middle is, pretty short routes.
Yep.
But you get out to Bethesda Elementary School down in rural Williamson County, and they could be 15 miles.
Yep.
But I'll say this,
We're
on
truly
this side
gonna
for Fairleigh
have
and I, sorry, Chairman.
If the money is gonna follow the student.
Yep.
Then that's a piece of it, and that is
Yep.
student specific, geographic specific,
Yep.
not district wide, unless you have.
But you can calculate that with
City.
miles traveled. How many miles was the bus running?
Yeah. They know.
And time.
But more
Miles and
specific.
time and put on for each school.
Yeah, but more specific to the schools, not just the district,
Right.
because like for Fairleigh and I bet pretty much everybody on this end of the table, we've all knocked on a whole lot of doors, just meeting folks for no particular purpose, but just to go out and knock doors and get to know them a little bit better every other year for us. And so when you're knocking doors in Westmoreland and visiting with folks in my district, in our district, it's a lot less densely populated. You're going down driveways that are half mile long. You're going on farms that are, several acres. If you're knocking doors in Hendersonville, and down visiting with folks there, it's dense subdivisions. It's pretty close. it's, there's going to be
Yeah.
drastically different needs, I think, for both those, just like what Jack said in his district. It's just, I don't know. And I think that's very different needs.
So, so going back to this 10 people per square mile or 25, to me, the better data is miles driven and time extended
Bus route.
Bus routes.
per school.
But yeah, that's what I was gonna say, because this is really getting at transportation, right? The sparsity question is really just about.
Yeah, it's 75% transportation and 25% is resource. I think to the point you made earlier, resources that don't exist in rural that maybe an urban could pull from. A rural community doesn't have a YMCA on the corner, and so they actually have to spend the money to get some of those services that could be elsewhere. So it's like-
I wanted you to say that because I didn't want to get lost in just if you go with miles traveled, then you lose the other things that sparsity impacts.
Do miles travel indicate the sparsity better than the 25 students per square mile? Right? Is that your point? It's just I think it goes into that, right, Chairman? But it's just a different way to figure it.
Well, yeah, I get it, except if I'm potentially gaming the system, then all of a sudden now I build a school here and I draw a really big district around it because now I've got all these miles I've got to travel, right?
Or you do the longer bus route,
Yeah.
because now you can have up to an hour. And you
Yeah,
would get
good
funded
point.
for kids, yeah. I'm assuming the best in everyone, but I certainly provide the information, just want that to know.
Good news in Sumner County, we got an app for that. You can follow the school bus a little app.
So the recommendation from the subcommittee was 25 students or less?
Yeah, it was essentially 25 students per square mile or less. From a data source, just want to note that we got this from the NCES codes. Those are things that are identified by the federal government. So again, from a third-party verification perspective, we are not coming up with that at the department. There is a data source that we are pulling from. I think, again, want to continue to make sure that it is a third-party verified space that we are pulling the number from. It's not like a calculation that we make with discretion.
And to me, it also there's a positive in using the students per square mile because it matches the federal, we've changed the number, but at least that we can say this is based on, federal numbers as well, or federal methodology.
Yep, that's right. And we can do that at the district level or at the school level because the NCES code is at the school level. So it does allow us to keep it about the school in which the student is enrolled. Is that in a rural community or not? And that's how the feds have
Well,
that
again,
structure.
what did the subcommittee think about that?
I think that they prefer to not have to do paperwork. And so the easiest way is you are qualified or not. I will say in the 25-to-1 part of the conversation was, does it change with bus routes and things like that? It doesn't. You're going to get the same clean data based on the NCES codes as if we did any kind of other calculation. So they were comfortable.
Did they prefer
25.
based on the school? No, based on the school level or based on the district level? Which did they prefer for the 25 students per square mile? Or maybe I misunderstood what you were saying.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think they were more interested in the calculation itself. There wasn't a lot of conversation school or district. Okay, direct funding. So this is, I don't know if we want to wait for Leader Johnson to come back. I know he cares a lot about this subject, but I will give the overview on direct funding. So right now, we have the focus on elementary school reading. That is from the Learning Loss and Student Acceleration Bill. It is currently a requirement. It is not currently funded. So this is, as a reminder, if you are in the approaching category, you either are retained or you retake the test or you do summer school or you do tutoring. Because the state is already paying for summer school, there is a funded option. If you are in the below category on the TCAP, you are either retained or you have a chance to retake the test or you do summer school and tutoring. And so what this does for direct funding is those students who are at the below level after third grade, it pays for the tutoring for that student. So that way that component or requirement is funded as written. So just wanted to we gave that to the subcommittees. I think they understood that was the limitation. It wasn't for any student who wasn't proficient. It was specific to fund that requirement in existing statute. I want to see if there's, yes, sir.
Oh, now, is that, it was created a problem when we did the special session with all the backlog of third grade students in a lot of districts, fussed at us. Once you get that bigger window or bigger backlog. Is there any thought to moving this also to the first and second grade as they transition along, such as the tutoring things, instead of just waiting until the third grade? Because I know we don't do the TCAP at the end until third grade, but we're doing screening, right?
Yeah, so what we can do is we can cost that out and say for those students who are at a certain level of proficiency on the screener in second grade, first grade, this is what that cost would be for tutoring for those students. So what we can do is give you some cost options about what that would be. Right now, we just have that direct funding for the third grade to fourth grade tutoring component because that's what's required in statute. We did get a lot of feedback about how do we provide additional supports for those K through third grade students. What we can do is say, look, here's what it would cost if we did the students who aren't quite proficient in those grades and give you that as an option for direct funding.
I think that'd be very valuable, so we don't wait till there's an issue, and then they're getting ready going forward.
Right. Okay. For CTE, this was just a quick follow-up. We talked about it briefly. I think that there's a broader conversation we can certainly have at the next meeting based on the information you would like us to bring. This is moving towards where the rest of the country is going. I do want to say Tennessee has been at the forefront of CTE and has continued to be a national leader in this. Where it is moving is not treating all CTE programs the same. Funding the same for someone who is in, and I hate to call out programs because then everyone from that area gets very upset, but I will use just what my cousins are in because then that's just like a personal thing. I have a number of cousins who did cosmetology. That is what they did. That is not necessarily the same as how it is defined for a high demand, high wage job. A high demand, high wage job might be something in medical sciences. It might be welding. It could be teaching as a profession. What you are seeing a couple of states move to, some examples are Indiana and Texas are two states that just moved to this, is that you incentivize completers and you incentivize more money for those professions that are more aligned to economic need. So a 9th grade course gets less money than a 12th grade course. That's to ensure that students actually complete their CTE pathways. There's an incentive for districts to offer those courses and support students on that pathway. You also give more money for welding courses than you might for cosmetology or floral design, because there is a greater need for more welders than there are for cosmetologists. That's examples. I know we will get letters about all of that, and apologies in advance, but those are the examples that I can give you from Indiana, and they have that mapped out. So you can imagine essentially a 4 square of I am a kind of high demand, high wage track versus I am a lower demand, lower wage track. High demand, high wage gets more per student. Lower wage, lower demand gets less per student, and you get more for each year in which you continue that. What we have seen in terms of outcomes, because that's essentially what we've been looking at, you have more students complete their pathways, and you also have more students or you have more schools that offer higher demand, high wage pathways. That tends to be the behavior change that you see. And again, we have seen that in Indiana. We've seen that shift. We've seen that shift in Florida. We are seeing that shift in Texas. They are just making those changes based on what they did in their new formula in 2019. So that is something that we heard a lot of positive feedback about in terms of, yeah, it'd be great if we could get funded for this pathway that is more expensive to educate kids on versus treating everything the same. So I just want to open that up for conversation, feedback, et cetera. We would go through the similar process that we do for tiering and credentials. So it's industry and workforce, it is education, and it is higher ed come together, and they make those determinations, and that goes through a rulemaking process. So I want to kind of pause there. I'm happy to, the Indiana approach is on our website as one of some of the materials we submitted to the subcommittee, as is the Texas approach. The Indiana approach, I think, walks through it pretty methodically, and it's aligned with the direction that we're seeing a lot of states who want to emphasize more outcomes in CTE.
One thing I heard you say that's not on the handout here was the cost of providing this education. Is one of the considerations for in making this a priority. It's not only high demand and high wage, but it's cost of.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I will make sure to make that change. Some of the feedback we've received, and just very candidly, is like, look, we can train kids on machinery that's 20 years old, and it's not actually going to help them when they go to get a job, because that's not what they're using now. There are some other things that we've talked about related to ensuring we can get people in real time. Maybe I own a construction company and I'm coming in to teach in the construction class using, these are real practices and best practices and things that are in real time needs if my student is going to then matriculate into that profession. And so thinking very differently about, not all CTE pathways are the same. And if we want to do a one size fits all and continue that, we absolutely can. I'm offering a different option that is aligned to prioritizing and funding based on the real costs and needs of the professions that we are trying to educate students to then move into. So, yes, sir.
Who determines that need? Is it determined at the school level or the state level? Because it'll be much different depending on the location.
So what we've done with the industry credentials is we work in the labor and workforce zones. So they have regions for labor and workforce. Labor and workforce industry partners come to the table with K-12 and higher ed, so TBR and THEC come to the table and they make decisions about, look, in Northwest Tennessee, maybe it's ag tech. That's a really significant need. That's going to look very different if we're in Hamilton County or if we're in Northeast Tennessee. And so it doesn't have to be statewide. There are some things that are statewide, so we need them across the state. Others are prioritized by regions, and we would maintain with that level of I think, specificity. So that has been what we've done in other areas, again, with industry credentials and how we've tiered that. We are now in a tiered system for industry credentials. This would just extend that now into the actual coursework, not just the test at the end of the program.
Is there a reevaluation of these on a timetable?
Annually. So you would have an annual, that tends to be what happens is you look at the list. Should you add things? Should you move things around based on what the needs are? what I've seen as a best practice is there's some grandfathering in. If a student's on a pathway, you want to make sure that they don't just eliminate the pathway. You allow the child to complete the pathway. But again, Indiana does this, Texas moved into this with their new funding model, and then Florida has done this. The outcomes we are seeing are more completers, but specifically more completers in high demand, high wage fields. It is an incentive for districts to offer those, especially because, I mean, very candidly, some of those high wage, high demand fields are more expensive. Those are more expensive pathways to provide at your school. So if you're getting the same for all of the pathways, there's not really an incentive besides intrinsic motivation, which I know folks have, but you don't actually, you're not funded for that. So this is essentially to make sure that we are providing the pathways for the jobs that Tennessee will need, as opposed to treating everything the same and then it becoming more of a decision based on other things that have nothing to do with CTE or pathways. It's total dollars.
Well, I totally agree. We had THEC and TR in education yesterday, and presentations that are right in line with this also.
It is the direction that the country seems to be moving. It makes, from my perspective, more sense to do in concert with the funding formula, because otherwise you're making programmatic decisions that are completely divorced from how you fund schools or students.
We fund 4 years on completion rates, so why not CTE in high school?
But just, I'd like to hear from the group actually, but what about in a community where none of this industry exists? Does that create wage jobs? So what happens, I mean,
How does it work for
how
them?
does that work for them? Do they not get the fund, they don't get the calculus, and then so what, how does that impact upon them?
And
I'm trying to think, I'm
so-
not sure what I'm trying to say, but
Well, is it based on the number of jobs in the community, or is it based on the CTE pathways? Like, and I'll brag on Sumner County, from to my knowledge, we have more CTE pathways than any other district in the state. And it's not necessarily because we have those specific industries in our community, but those kids can go out to wherever in the state that those exist. So, I mean, is it the
Well-
number, like, which is it that we're figuring?
yeah, so you're kind of, you're in the thread that I'm trying to think through is, so you actually result in a community losing population because you train kids in certain skills that are not available in their community. And so they leave the community. And once they leave the community, the likelihood that they come back diminishes with each year that they're gone. So what is there a negative, I guess I'm trying to think, what is the negative impact to communities that don't have any of these kind of jobs?
But
Sure,
that
I'll tell
really
you-
is a chicken and egg argument,
Yeah.
because if you only are training students for jobs that are available in their communities and those are not high paying jobs, then you're just continuing that cycle. So, that's where I think education and economic development to have to go hand in hand, because you have to be about recruiting new jobs in those situations.
And my chairman said it best. I mean, that's exactly what we've been doing. I mean, our hope is that some of these industries will actually then locate in Sumner County, because we've had, we have more of those programs there and they're available. So exactly that.
And that's the dilemma we have now. We're losing our rural communities because same thing. So yeah, you're right.
But at the same time, you want to prop up a rural community by kind of forcing your children to stay there and not be.
Did the subcommittee have this kind of conversation?
Yes, so I
Okay,
think,
so
yeah,
can
this
go
is,
back and listen to what the subcommittee kind
Yes.
of talked about.
they did.
And some of it, just for reference, they do some of these activities already as part of their federal Perkins plan. It is a local needs assessment that answers some of these questions. But I think to the point that was just made, that meets the immediate need. There's a question about how you drive the future needs as well.
And I know Representative Haston has something I want to just on the website, and we will send this to you as a separate email, but it gives you, if you want to just actually see what it looks like in Indiana as an example, I'm not saying we would do it this way, but it gives you the sense of high value program is $680 per student, level 1, level 2, but then they have moderate value, which now you're starting at 400, or less than moderate value starts at 200. And so they essentially price the programs that way. They have a different set for apprenticeships, work-based learning, cooperative education programs, et cetera. But it gives you an actual dollar figure And what they've seen is they've actually used this similar to what we might do in West Tennessee. Now we have programs in high schools, or we'll build programs in high schools so that the Blue Oval City, they will be hiring Tennesseans and not importing talent from elsewhere. You can actually do some partnership where it's part of your recruitment. So you want to get a business to come in, you say, great, we will have that pathway at our high school. So you'll actually have a source of future employees. It actually ends up being a pretty, I think to the chair lady's point, a really important part of economic development. If you are really strategic about it, but that is part of it. And so Representative Haston, I think I heard a.
Yeah, thank you. I just, anytime we're talking about CTE pathway talk, I get kind of excited, and I think I tried to jump in a little bit too soon a while ago. But anyhow, I just, with that being said, I just think that there might be some opportunity to start looking at some things with TBR and THEC about trying to maybe clear some room in the course schedule, and some of these kids that are focused on this career technical path are not having to take some courses like physics and chemistry and some of the higher level fourth mathematics that's required, and maybe maybe even looking at foreign language, some of these things that might be able to be cleared up, and some flexibility for the schedule, and allow for some additional CTE courses, or even something that's a little bit more maybe practical for some CTE students to take. I just wanted to make sure that we kind of keep that in mind as we start looking at this whole revamped model. Thanks.
So we will just kind of resend the Indiana material, and I think just think about that, and we'll revisit what that could look like. I do want to ask about outcomes, because I know there were lots of conversations and feedback about that last time. You have the outcomes, a little bit of a cold list, but more importantly, really want to understand eligibility for the outcomes. That is a very significant decision that needs to be made, and that's kind of these 2 pages together. This is potentially that list. We took off some of the things. I know Chair Lady Hazelwood had some feedback. We took off those components. This is a shorter list. I think it could still get shorter. It's really up to you all. It includes literacy and some of the subcommittee feedback. It includes ready grad indicators, and then CTE completers, work-based learning, and apprenticeships. So happy to cross off, add on, et cetera. But also with that is who qualifies. And the biggest conversation and policy decision is, and this is split, and I want to be really candid, there was not agreement on subcommittees. Is this only available to low-income students, or students who are economically disadvantaged, or any student who has a unique learning need and or is low income, or everybody?
And I apologize, I've got to step out a moment, but I mean, when we're talking about funding, and we're talking about funding the specific student and starting from scratch and like building that up, and we're talking about other indicators like poverty and other issues that will potentially increase money for students, why would we not be talking about every child when it comes to outcomes? What's the other side of that coin? Because I don't understand what the split is, because we should care about the outcomes of all of our students, not just those that fall within special categories.
So I will say that the other side in terms of the argument that we've heard is you are, and if I can speak just very candidly, it's okay, well, that all the money's just going to go to those wealthy districts that already do well, and they already have a leg up. And it's all these other districts who have XYZ issues aren't going to. I am not saying that it's accurate. I'm saying that is what I am hearing.
But again, the characteristics that we are looking at is not wealth. The characteristics that we are looking at is hopefully figuring in something that is a specific measurable outcome that we want our students to achieve.
Yes.
So, I mean, wealth's in here for funding students more if they fall within, I mean, just the conversation we had earlier. But to completely just ignore a segment of our children because they happen to come from a 2-parent household or a wealthier household or something else and say, well, we don't care about your outcomes. Just me, that seems a little ridiculous.
And I would say that is very clearly the other half of the argument we've heard, which is if we are funding based on need, isn't the intent of that to get all students able to achieve, and so all students should be eligible, and we should be supporting all students to achieve those outcomes.
And also to make an assumption that just because a child lives in a wealthy community that they do not have either mental health issues or substance abuse issues or learning disabilities or learning issues or have not had, I mean, like that, I don't know, that's just me. I don't
Yeah.
buy that at all. I would like to know how all of our children are doing with outcomes and push all of them to achieve highly, regardless where they come from.
I would come from the perspective of we're addressing the low income in another part of the formula.
Yeah.
So we've already addressed that.
Mhm.
So to make the argument, well, these are low income kids, well, we've already addressed that. So now everybody, that level sets,
Yep.
right?
Yes,
So
sir.
now whether you're rich or poor, we've level set. And so this is just the next, you don't get extra credit. That's already level set.
Yeah.
That's the way I,
Yeah.
that's the way I.
Don't get double extra.
Yeah,
Made it much better
exactly.
than I was able to.
But is your question of us,
Well, that was
are
one.
these,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Are these, is this all inclusive of the outcomes, or are we, I don't mean, I wouldn't know what kind of possible outcome others you could do.
Yes, so I think question one is, from this list as a starting point, are there things that you would want to remove? Are there things that you don't see here? And then question two is the eligibility. I think what I'm hearing is all students. There's also some consideration of if a school, because remember, this is generated by the student, but it's kind of the bonus, so it's held at the school. Is this something where we say if you are an F school, you have work to do school-wide? So that was some feedback that we got, which is if you are a low-performing school, we don't want you to just focus on this population of kids. You actually need to do work on lots of kids, and you generate additional priority school dollars from the federal government. So do you qualify for an outcomes bonus or not? That was a consideration that came up from the subcommittees, and then whether we do proficiency and or growth. So those are the two policy questions based on this list of what would count. So if there are things on this list that you would say, this should not be something that we don't want the state to use this for an outcomes bonus, that doesn't resonate, we can continue to cull and cross off. Or if there are things that you would want to add, we're, of course, would add to that list. We culled up from last time.
Well, I think William referenced, or somebody did, what is the state kind of set for its standards, right?
Mm-hmm.
But some of these, I mean, how many of them are going to stay around? Is the ACT and the SAT going to stay around? I mean, there's more and more conversation about those kinds of objective measures going away, or at least not being a part of a education calculus.
And that we would remove that. So I think it's an important point, is that anything that would be here would be something that we would need to revisit, especially on the outcome. So if you all said like, look, we want to actually add this, or SAT and ACT is non-existent moving forward, we would adjust this list based on that annual feedback. What we chose to include here was essentially what's in our current accountability system, because that is what we do now, plus literacy. And then CTE and work-based learning were two of the things that we'd heard feedback about. We took off things like JROTC and FAFSA completion, took off those from last time, but right now we have it aligned to our existing accountability system and those indicators.
Just interesting, because UT was up trying to defeat the ACT, and because they use the GPA as their major tool for what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
Not on there, and not because then we put pressure on those schools to pay. So let's
Let's bump up our
bump
GPA.
these up. But it's just an interest, just a side note.
Well, that was my point,
Right.
is that, higher ed is moving away from using those as a metric as to whether someone qualifies for higher ed or not,
But we still
for
pay
a number
for
of reasons.
Yes.
We pay for the ACT, so.
But isn't so much of our system based upon the other stuff, not just the ACT? I mean, we start breaking that down, aren't we kind of pulling the bottom Lincoln logs out?
Yeah, and from just like a decision-making philosophy approach for y'all, is it that you want to pick 3 or 4 things and say, these are the things we care about the most, and that's what we want to have outcomes for. Like, we want this to be true no matter what. Or is this about saying we want to match this with the current ways that we hold people accountable? Is it a strategic approach on where we want emphasis, or is it an alignment approach around what we currently do? And I mean, defer to you all about kind of direction and where you would want to push the state. But Chair Leedy. Not sure if you were gonna.
I'm just, personally, I would prefer to push higher ed back to an objective measurement like an ACT or an SAT than us forego it. I think that's just a major mistake on their part. So I would prefer to keep that in our measurements, so at least we have some objective knowledge of how our kids are performing.
Yeah.
I don't know a better objective measurement.
Yeah, I agree.
Until we have one.
So the state's mantra is job ready or college ready, right?
Yep.
So which of these metrics best, and I don't have enough expertise to know, but which of these metrics measure our movement towards that goal, being job ready or being college ready? Well, I mean, obviously, but I mean, clearly in the last 5 years, the legislature and the executive branch have really moved in the direction of job ready.
Yep.
Right? Because the data tells us that most of the kids that are college ready are going to college, right? And so we have smartly started to refocus our energy on the 65% or so of students that we should acknowledge are not college ready.
Yep.
And if that's the strategy that the state is taking, then we ought to use metrics that sort of drive us in that direction. I think the lottery data and other data, ACT data, would tell us that the kids that are college ready regardless of what we're doing here. And so if the emphasis on, hey, we really need to have a ready and reliable workforce that has some level of higher education, be it TCAT or whatever it is, then the metric ought to be measuring our K-12 schools. Are you driving that pipeline? And I don't know which of these does that, whether it's because when you get into talking about dual enrollment, dual credit, well, then that is constrained by how much money we put into that, right? So, I'm not sure which of these things measure those kind of things, but I do think I'm looking for feedback from my colleague. But I think we have said job ready is really, I would argue we are now saying job ready is more important to us.
Yep.
Because what the data tells us about our students being ready.
Well, in some ways, isn't that industry credential piece that would relate to that, I would assume.
For those last three, are they valuable at all? I don't think they're at the same level.
That's right.
Fair.
Yeah, I would just need more. I agree with you. I don't know what. I'm not sure how that metric works. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use it, but I'm not sure how it works.
I mean, I think candidly, if you all wanted to move in a direction where you were doing some of the incentives for the CTE programs around completers, et cetera, then you don't necessarily need to also dual incent on the outcome side. So that's part of the give and take there, because you're already giving the carrot to get those students all along the pathway to completers. If you wanted outcomes to be kind of much more about, look, if you're college or career, and college as measured by ACT performance and or SAT, and career based on whether or not you earned the industry credential, that is the ultimate kind of endpoint of your CTE pathway, that ends up being much more about the outcome. Or you can fund the process, which is going to be the credits that you earn along the way, which is AP, dual credit, all the other stuff. So that's why we wanted to leave all of those on here. It could just be like, look, we want to make sure in an absolute term, the kids meet the benchmark at the end of the process, and that's what we want to fund. That's what you would see if you kind of limited to ACT, SAT, and industry credentials. So that's another approach. I'm hearing, though, maybe a less excitement about dual credits, AP, some of that work, that's actually just.
Correct.
Okay, great. Any preferences on, is it every school no matter what? Do you want to limit the schools that are eligible? I'm hearing that all students are eligible. That's what I'm walking away with in terms of what we would model for you in a formula model. But any kind of other limitations on eligibility or proficiency versus growth, that has been something that comes up. Do you want to do growth since we pay for the retake on the ACT? Do you want to do absolute measure plus growth between test A and test B?
That's stage 2 of this conversation.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then the only last one, because we want to model and get you numbers, and I'm just going to squeeze out maybe 60 seconds more feedback from you. And I'm looking at you, Leader Johnson, because I know it's the fast growing in particular. That's, I know, important for everybody, but I know particularly important policy question. Is it just real time? So essentially, I grew this many more students, and I'm funding through the formula current year, because I remember at Cheerleading Hazel, we had you had some good feedback about you're incurring the costs in this year, so you should get funding in this year. So for fast growing, is it about funding the students, the addition in students, and or is it about the one-time costs related to things like I have to add buses, I have to have portables while I'm building a school building, some of the infrastructure investments? We kind of are making an assumption that if a school has grown and has 2% more kids than it did the last year, we are funding those new kids using the same formula, because those are kids in classrooms, they need teachers, those are real-time dollars. That is we are assuming that you are moving in that direction, but want to get confirmation there based on the conversation last time. That's our assumption. But number 2 is, do you want this kind of additional pot for people who have grown consistently over time for those one-time costs as they are building out infrastructure? And so would love any kind of feedback, because there's a dollar implication there, and we want to make sure to include that in what we provide for you.
Well, first of all, for me, it would be and.
Mm-hmm.
So it would definitely be and. And the concern you have with Sumner County, Rutherford County, and I'm focusing on Middle Tennessee, but there's other areas of the state as well.
Yep.
Williamson County, you're building a new school every year. And some of this may be tied into the accountability, and I know we're running short on time, but this is something you can expect I will want to drill down on. Is it's high performing. Okay, so if there's a mechanism in the formula for high performing school districts, because one of the reasons Sumner County's growing as fast as they are, and Williamson County, and they have great schools. They're high performing schools. So that is drawing people in and resulting in those districts having to build. In Williamson County, we're building a new school every year. And I would caution in terms of using the term one time.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing that, but
Yep.
when Williams County builds a school, they bond it over 20 years.
Yeah, it's fair.
So it's just take that into consideration too. They're not stroking a check for the $70 million high school. They're issuing bonds and assuming the debt and then having to amortize that debt over whatever period of time.
That's fair.
So again, and I don't know if we'll get to it in this meeting, but in the accountability piece, I know there have been conversations with the subcommittees about accountability, rewarding good performance, for districts. That can certainly be an offset, because if it's a high performing school district, a good chance it's a fast growing school district. Yeah. Not always, but if it's a high performing district, that's a big reason people are moving to Williams County, renting their apartments so they can get their kids in the system.
Yeah, that's fair. It's a good and interesting point about the outcomes component of high performing helping to offset is another reason why we would include all students. Exactly. I hadn't thought of it that way. It's really interesting.
And thankfully, with Chairman Watson and others in the body, we've been doing some one-time appropriations for fast-growing districts, and that started under Charles Sargent, and very grateful for that. The problem is, again, the county's issuing bonds to pay for those schools over 20 years. So as grateful as we are, it doesn't help. As a banker, you inherit $10,000 from your Aunt Edna. That's a lot different than counting on $10,000 a year, into the future versus a one-time allocation.
Yeah, that's great.
Commissioner, I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Whenever you want.
Lot to digest. I'm just trying to relate, of course, in West Tennessee, at that Ford plant, these small communities are going to get hit in the next 2 years with a lot of population growth.
Sure.
And they're going to have to build new buildings. Is this taking into account those? Are going to get it pretty soon? And
That is part of why we think bifurcating those two decisions is so important. There's the student, but there's also there are a lot of people moving to Tennessee, right? I mean, I think over the last 10 years, we have a 20% increase or more in students, or in the last 10 years, actually, we've had a 20% increase in students. There are a lot of fast growing areas. What we would propose in terms of a fast growing dollar amount really does hinge on whether we are just doing the student or any infrastructure costs associated. It is a very different number. That's separate. It's not part of kind of the formula, but it is part of education funding as kind of this one-time expense for the student before they're in the calculation, or this pot related to infrastructure. And that's why we really want to make sure we understand philosophically how you want us to approach this. And so I'm making an assumption that we're going to continue with, we're funding for the student in the growth, and then the infrastructure, we can give you some good ideas on that. But I will just flag again that West Tennessee is a really good example of what they might want now, even when we think about the local component, might look very different 10 years from now. And I would strongly encourage us to have that conversation about, are we going to continue to Band-Aid as the state changes? And we have a lot of Band-Aids right now where this district had a big change in who they were, what they looked like. And then we just add kind of this aid grant, and we've got a bunch of aid grants everywhere as like a nice thing that we've extended. Or are we going to say, this is how we fund, and as your community changes, we need to start planning, and you live within your means. And if you're growing, that means you contribute. That's going to look different in West Tennessee. And I think that is definitely not appropriate for education to weigh in on. That is a very kind of a much bigger conversation that we will present to you all these different options, but we are a fast growing state, and that means that districts are going to change. Some are going to lose enrollment. Are we going to continue to fund for enrollment that is never coming back? We do that for some districts right now. Just being honest, we do. If districts are growing, they are going to pay more into the pot. Yeah. And are we okay with that, or are we going to not? Or is the state going to cover that difference? That's where it gets. Those are hard decisions. We certainly have recommendations, but I don't want to shy away from the fact that that's kind of, I hope we can kind of really get into that, and some of the ways that we've modeled that out.
Makes sense. Well, in a perfect world, and nothing is ever a perfect world.
Like, bring me there.
But, you know, Sumner County's property tax base is growing year over year. And Rutherford's is, and Wilson's is, and Williamson's is, and so you're right, and that they have to, you know, bear their brunt of the growth, because they're, in theory, they should be generating more revenue at the local level. As someone who represents a very fast-growing county, I think that's very fair. Mm-hmm. But I do think the state is lagging in terms of helping offset some of the overwhelming infrastructure costs for some of those schools. Yeah. And again,
that's fair.
And I could use Sumner, I could use Rutherford, Wilson, Williamson. One of the primary drivers is the quality of the education that people are getting in those areas. And so they're being punished because they're high-performing districts. Yeah. And because the state's not, I don't believe, doing its part in terms of offsetting the expense of that exponential growth.
Yeah. It's a really fair point.
I'm done.
Explain a little more. You said we're funding counties that are losing population at the same rate. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
That's the current system.
Mm-hmm. So in our current system, we have a floor, and so there are some districts. I'm not necessarily going to say it's not necessarily a county. We've got a county example. We've got some district, not county examples, where their ADM has declined, but we essentially keep them whole as if those ADM were still there. And that is an amount of money we give to that district.
So we have that in statute that we're not going to lower that.
But it's forevermore. So what we've seen is best practice in other states. That was some homework I think you gave me, Chairman. In other states, what tends to happen is and I'll give the Iowa example, but it's if you decline by more than, let's say, 5%, we will cover you for anything greater than 5% for 1 year. So that way, if there's something massive that happens, a natural disaster, whatever it might be, you will absorb that 5%, but anything more than that, the state will take care of for 1 year. And then you're back to what the kids who actually, it gives you time to plan. Right now, there are some districts where we provide additional money for that loss, but we do it forever. And it is a significant amount of money,
5% over what timeline?
just 1 year. So if you,
Because I've got, in my district, I've got it, hey, over time, it's gone down 8%. So.
and so that would be, let's say they declined 6% in 1 year, we would say, look, we'll cover you that 1%, but just for that year, and then you're gonna have to live within your means after that. But what we're doing now for some districts is saying you declined 8%, we're gonna cover you that full 8% forever. And then you never have to make the reductions that reflect your current population.
Yeah.
That's why they have really nice facilities.
Yeah, I
It's
was
the
like,
same process of in reverse
mhm,
of the fast growing.
that's right.
Right.
Yeah,
We're doing
they-
it on
they
both
got
ends.
Jack, there where your money is.
Yeah, yeah. But I want to call that out because I think, and we can give you that direct information of which districts and what that looks like. We do the same thing for kind of the local contribution piece where there are some where we, in statute, we give you essentially, we give this district a grant. District A, we say we are giving you a grant to contribute to what you owe the state because of whatever reason. Those are just some of the hard decisions that are going to have to be made. Are we going to keep doing that? Or are we going to just say like, look, if we're going to do we're going to do it right, and part of it's going to be great, and here are ways that we can, as we've heard from a couple of the folks who run these calculations, like you can buy yourself out of the problem for the transition, but ultimately, are you going to make the decision about doing the right thing for a standard formula that is applied fairly and is applied consistently, or are we going to Band-Aid and kind of plug the holes in the boat? And so that is, we will give you that information. We will kind of run, these are the districts, here's who benefits, here's who's been getting some of these aids, these aid packages, here's what that would mean for them.
We need that information, but I think that could be a graduate also. It doesn't have to be just 1 year. You can
That's
do,
right.
if it's an 8%, you can do 8% the first year for the next, or, you know,
Yes.
and the same thing in the growth, going back to Jack's comment. You know, you can't take for 20 years, but you could do some graduate help in that
Right.
short term.
Right. And forgive me if I missed it, Commissioner. So conversation we all have about the salary funding and the BEP, did we touch on that, or would that be addressed in the base? And if I understood correctly, that it's the administration's position that we want to fix this.
Yes.
BEP only pays for 200 teachers, even though they have 285 teachers. So and how will that be addressed? Because there might be a district that is just hiring too many teachers that they don't really need. But at the same time, for those that are stepping up to keep their student-teacher ratios down, and how is that? Is that in the base?
Yes, sir. So what's calculated out is that you would have a teacher based on the existing ratio. So let's say it's a second grade, 20 students fund that salary. We also have instructional assistants that are funded in here, but you can think about things like if you have a bunch of economically disadvantaged students, that district might choose to hire kind of more teachers, have smaller class sizes. That is still covered because of the weight. All that being said is that's all in the base. The increase in terms of our salary schedule is something that currently is set by the state board. You increase it $1,000 at the minimum. It trickles out to everybody for making sure that money gets to the teacher, which is, I think, the problem we absolutely want to solve. Is we looked at a bunch of states and what they do. Part of it's defining what a teacher is. Right now, what we are thinking about is it's really hard to audit against what % of time you spend with this many kids on this day. But we do have an evaluation system that very clearly defines you get evaluated. It's data we already have. So what we are considering and thinking about is saying if you are evaluated on the team's rubric or through that system, you are at a school site and you are with students. That is actually, there are a number of different ways, and that includes counselors. It does include the instructional support in RTI. It includes traditional teachers, special education, et cetera. So that would be the minimum. There's also some groups in there. So if you wanted to limit it more, you still could, but we have an actual data source that already exists. And you would say, the General Assembly and governor want to put whatever, $50 million, $10 million, $100 million into teacher salaries. You can actually say it has to go to existing teachers who were evaluated on the rubric. That is how you make sure that it connects over. It's still in the base, it still produces money through the weights, and that'll fund the additional teachers, but it is in the base line item connected to those specific staff members. We've never done that before, and that would be a shift.
But it still will be tied to, right, and again, I don't know that this would occur, but it might, if there's a district out there that just hires more teachers. I mean, there's still a formula that dictates kind of what you're supposed to have. Is there, I guess, based on what you anticipate proposing, will there be a scenario where a district could have teachers outside of what is funded in the new formula?
Districts could fund, if districts wanted to fund way more teachers outside of the formula, in theory, they absolutely could. The money that we would allocate for teacher increases is generated by the student and the student need. So the same amount is going to go, so let's say it's Washington District, right? Washington District has a certain number of kids. If we put in a certain amount of money for teacher salaries as a state, that money is going to Washington County based on the students. How the district chooses to allocate that, the restriction we have is it has to go to existing people. It cannot be used to fund more people outside of, and that's oftentimes that's what happens. It has to be existing people. Now that might not mean every teacher, that is a district level decision. If they have, strategic compensation packages, if they want to do performance based, if they want to do it across the board, that's not a spending plan, but it does say those dollars go to people who were in the classroom when that money was generated. And that would be the link that we don't currently have right now.
But if I hear you, or what I think I hear you is let's say that the formula is designed to fund 100 teachers. And the district chooses to hire 100 teachers and hire an additional 20 teachers outside of what we were funding. And then we do a pay increase for the classroom teachers. And that money goes down, and at the local level, they dilute that increase because they also give that additional 20 teachers
Which is what happened.
the pay increase. So we really haven't solved the problem that we have now, right? So I think that's what you're trying to get at, isn't it?
Yeah, so it is not solving the problem of district level decisions about how many teachers they hire and then that total amount getting diluted. What it is solving is that right now, the increase to the instructional component, that money might not be used for increases at all. So sometimes districts get that and they'll use that money and just hire more teachers as opposed to give a raise. What this says is you are deciding how you want to use your budget in terms of the number of teachers you hire. But when we say that money has to go to salary increases or raises, it is attributing it only to that. You cannot use it for anything else except salary increases. And that's not necessarily what's happening now. Part of the ballooning is you put in $100 million for teacher increases, and that $100 million might not ever be spent on increases. It might only be spent getting all these extra teachers that may or may not be necessary.
Well, it begs the question, and I don't have a solution, but are you better off having 100 teachers that are paid well than 120 that's spread out to the point that they're not getting all that increase like they do?
Well, and in fairness, I'm sorry, Carol, but in fairness, I guess that there does have to be at some point, we can't just fund every teacher that a district might want to hire. They may want to choose to get down to an 8-to-1 student-teacher ratio, and we can't do that. If they want to do that with their own money, then more power to them.
Yeah, that's
we do have to have some line in the sand at which we say we're going to fund up to a student-teacher ratio of this point. That's the flip side of the argument I was trying to make too.
I see.
Yeah,
and we don't want to prohibit a district from hiring more.
Once we're funding the proper appropriate student-teacher ratio for that district or local, then if they want to hire more, it's all on. We're not paying 65% of the freight or 70% of the freight for them to keep hiring as many teachers as they want.
Right. I guess again, and I know you say, well, that's a local decision, but when we do a teacher pay increase, we are doing an increase for the teachers whom the state has calculated that district needs.
Yep, that's right.
Now, if they want to hire 20 additional teachers, they should not be able to use that should not. I'm trying to figure out why they're able to use our state dollars to fund a decision that they made locally.
Exactly.
Actually, we would say,
Exactly.
we'd say,
Yeah.
look, we're giving a pay raise to the teachers that we fund, and that's this group of teachers. Now, if you've hired 20 additional teachers, that's your choice, but it's also your responsibility
Yeah.
to make your own pay increase for those teachers. You can't take the state's money and dilute it to the 120 teachers. Is that?
Yeah, it's almost as if we need to, I'm being somewhat facetious, but it's almost as if we need to have BEP designated teachers. Okay, they have a little badge they wear. I'm a BEP teacher and I'm an outside the BEP teacher, so they, they kind of know because.
But that's,
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we've been trying to do,
Yeah.
and we keep failing because they're taking the money that we're providing to them and they're then applying it to decisions that they've made locally.
Yeah.
And it ends up that teachers come back and say, we never got a pay increase. You're like, well, it's not true.
We can solve for that. So I think that is a helpful, we were solving for the money getting to teacher salaries as opposed to expanding more teachers. But if we want to go to those, yeah.
We're gonna have the same problem.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's been our problem in the past. They always say we don't fully fund the BEP. Well, we do technically, but they've got 20 extra teachers.
Right.
So they said, and their argument is, well, the legislature, you want RTI teachers, you want this and that, so we've had to do it. So they put the burden back on us.
Now, the tough decision though is what is the proper student-teacher ratio that you're gonna fund? Because a lot of that occurrence is because we're not funding it. I'm not saying where it should be, I'm saying where we would like it to be, and therefore a lot of the districts that are doing that are so they can get that student-teacher ratio down to where it should be. So, I mean, if we need to fund, we need to not kid ourselves on what we ought to fund, to be able to meet that.
Well, and my hope would be that if we end up revising the formula and we end up doing this, that it will be better, that we are going to better fund the number of teachers that are there. The two districts in my Senate district, they're both way over. I mean, they got way more teachers. Do they have more than they really need? Maybe, I don't know, but I'm hoping that a new formula is going to help pay for some of those additional teachers.
In the base, we will have that base is going to be based on some kind of student-teacher ratio.
That's correct. That's correct.
The question is how much. And again, to Jack's point, it's almost to the point that you teachers would need to know, I'm funded by the state or
I'm funded by
not.
local.
I'm funded by the district.
Yeah.
And,
But it would,
That's up to
it would
classes
be
of
an
teachers,
interesting, does somebody have how many teachers there are out there over and above
Yes.
now? Do y'all have that? Because
Like what, 15,000?
About that. So there's 80,000 licensed people in the state, principals, teachers, all the things. There are 67,000 that are generated in the BEP.
So think about that. What is that? 15% or so? I mean,
20,000 people.
so that's about equal to the 750.
It's amazing how that all comes together.
Commissioner,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Wouldn't this kind of be solved a little bit what we're funding students based on weight? And one of them, like the ELL students, you're funding more if you got more ELL, which requires the RTI teacher. So therefore you're getting more money. Wouldn't it kind of be covered in that?
That's right. So right now in the BEP, you have EL, but you have like a ratio of, for an English learner, it generates this many teachers essentially, ADM. So it's not necessarily staffed in that same way, but it's the funding that would pay for those additional services. So it would operate similarly.
Okay.
So there will be some additional teachers that aren't just in that base ratio because of the services for special ed or EL. But to answer your question, Chair Lady, it's 1 to 20 is the ratio. Right now, we differentiate elementary, middle, and high school. We've actually put all that down to a standardized 1 to 20 to account for some of the fluctuations that are occurring in high school, just because of how their staff so differently than in elementary. But we'll get you all of that.
Okay, administration, vice principals. How is that dealt with?
So right now, in the base, what we have is a principal at every school. So the 300 schools who aren't currently funded for a principal, that they are here. And then on the AP, we do have an assistant principal that's generated one for every 5, so it's at a 500 to 1 ratio. So essentially a standard school generates an assistant principal at 500. We have that salary divided by 500 students. It's approximately $165 per kid in the base. And so for some super small schools, it's not going to fund an assistant principal, but if you've got a school for 250 students, that might not necessarily be as important as those 250, the assistant principal and the counselor funding might generate a completely different person that can do both of those jobs because the school is so small.
Or the 2,000 school would
Generate more.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Lots that we
Does that fall in, that does not fall into our discussion on raises for teachers? There's been a controversy there. Well, my administrator's gonna be making less than my teachers do if I don't spread this out. Conversation.
Keep great people in the classrooms. I love that.
Yeah, it's the biggest problem I have is we take a great teacher and make them a principal.
Yeah.
Because that's, that's their path. They get,
Yeah.
better
More-
retirement,
That's right.
honestly.
That's
So
right.
we need to really address that.
That's right. So I would just say there are other slides if you want to look at those, and then we will cover them at another time. We've got lots of homework. I love that. The teacher in me loves homework. And so I will leave it to kind of Charlie, Bill, and our team will loop back on kind of cadence and things like that for some follow-up meetings. I won't necessarily call them steering committee meetings, but some follow-up meetings that we can have to talk through specifics.
So later, I don't want to get out in front, but I mean,